The gavel had not yet fallen when the new federal judge stopped walking. He was halfway across the marble floor of Courtroom 4, his robe still swaying from the motion of his own footsteps, and then he simply stopped, staring at an old man in a gray uniform who was on his knees wiping coffee off the tile. Nobody in that room understood what they were witnessing. The lawyers kept shuffling their papers. The clerk kept typing. A young attorney sniggered under his breath and muttered something about the old man being slow again. And then the federal judge, a man sworn in only 3 weeks earlier, a man with the power to send people to prison for the rest of their lives, reached up with both hands and unfastened his own robe. He let it fall from his shoulders onto the courtroom floor like it meant nothing. He walked toward the janitor, and in front of 40 stunned witnesses, in front of lawyers who had spent 12 years spilling coffee near this man just to watch him crawl and clean it up, in front of a bailiff who had once called him boy, though he was 61 years old, the federal judge lowered himself to his knees. His voice cracked as he said the words that would change everything. Your Honor. The room went silent in a way that courtrooms rarely go silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. A woman in the gallery dropped her purse and didn't bend to pick it up. The old janitor, whose hands had frozen mid-wipe, looked up with an expression that wasn't shock. It was something heavier than shock. It was the look of a man who had spent over a decade waiting, without even knowing he was waiting, for someone to finally say his name the way it used to be said. To understand why a federal judge would kneel before a man in a cleaning uniform, you have to go back. You have to go back 12 years to a different courtroom, a different city, and a man named Elijah Monroe, who once wore the very robe now lying crumpled on the floor. Elijah Monroe had been a judge for 18 years before any of this happened. He was known across 3 counties as a man who read every page of every file before he ever opened his mouth in a hearing. Attorneys respected him because he never rushed a verdict, and defendants respected him because he was the rare judge who looked them in the eye when he spoke, not just at their file. He had built that respect slowly, deliberately, the same way he built everything in his life, brick by brick, patience by patience. He grew up in a small house behind a Baptist church where his mother cleaned floors for extra money on Sundays, and he used to sit in the back pew doing homework by candlelight because the electricity bill was always a week behind. Nobody in his family had ever gone to college, let alone law school, but Elijah had a memory like a steel trap and a hunger that nobody could explain, not even to himself. He worked 3 jobs through undergrad, slept 4 hours a night through law school, and by the time he was appointed to the bench at 41, his mother had already passed, but his wife Dorothy was there in the front row, crying so hard she had to hold onto the pew in front of her. Dorothy Monroe was the love of Elijah's life in the plain, unglamorous way that real love usually looks. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed grand gestures. She needed him home for dinner. She needed him to remember their daughter's dance recitals. And for the most part, he did remember because Dorothy made sure of it, taping little reminders inside his briefcase, calling his clerk to double-check his calendar. They had one daughter, Renee, born the same year Elijah passed the bar exam, and for a long time their life together looked like the kind of story people tell their grandchildren as proof that hard work pays off. Elijah rose through the ranks of the judiciary, eventually becoming one of the most respected circuit judges in the state, known for his fairness even by attorneys who lost cases in front of him. And that reputation, that decades-long reputation built on honesty, was exactly what made him dangerous to the people who needed him to look the other way. It started quietly, the way corruption always starts. A governor named Richard Holbrook had been in office for 6 years by the time Elijah's world began to collapse, and Holbrook had built an entire secondary economy around a group of privately run juvenile detention centers, facilities that were supposed to house troubled teenagers awaiting trial, but were in reality cash machines. Holbrook had struck a deal never written down, never recorded with the private operators of these centers. The longer a child stayed detained, the more money flowed into accounts connected through several layers of shell companies, back to Holbrook's own campaign network. Judges across the state were being quietly pressured, some through campaign donations, some through implied threats to their reappointment, to hand down harsher sentences for minor offenses, sentences that kept children in these centers far longer than any of the actual crimes warranted. Kids as young as 12 were being locked up for weeks over things like skipping school or shoplifting candy, because every extra day meant another few $100s in Holbrook's pocket. Elijah found out almost by accident. A public defender named Marcus Webb, exhausted and furious, brought him a case file for a 14-year-old boy named Tyrell who had been sentenced to 90 days for stealing a bicycle, a sentence wildly out of proportion to the offense handed down by a different judge in a neighboring county. Something about the file didn't sit right with Elijah. He started quietly pulling records, comparing sentencing patterns across the district, cross-referencing detention lengths against which facilities the children had been sent to. What he found chilled him. Over the course of 18 months, more than 300 children, most of them from poor families, many of them Black and Latino, had been given sentences 2 to 5 times longer than sentencing guidelines recommended, and nearly all of them had passed through facilities with financial ties, hidden but traceable to Holbrook's network. Elijah did what he believed was right. He began building a case, quietly, methodically, the way he built everything. He reached out to 2 other judges he trusted, an investigative reporter he had known for years, and eventually a state ethics commission. But before he could bring it fully into the light, before the evidence was airtight enough to survive the political storm that would follow, Holbrook's people struck first. They didn't come after him with the truth. They came after him with a lie, a devastatingly effective one. A case appeared seemingly out of nowhere, alleging that Elijah himself had taken bribes to reduce sentences for several defendants years earlier, cases pulled from deep in his record and twisted just enough to look damning out of context. The evidence was fabricated expertly. So, planted financial records, a coerced witness, a paper trail engineered by people with far more resources than one honest judge could ever match. Elijah realized with growing horror that if he pushed forward with exposing the juvenile detention scheme, Holbrook's people were prepared to destroy not just his career, but his entire family, freezing assets, dragging Dorothy and Renee's names through a fabricated scandal, possibly even manufacturing charges against people connected to him. Then came the moment that decided everything. Marcus Webb, the public defender who had first brought him Tyrell's file, came to him one night, terrified, saying that Holbrook's people had let it slip indirectly but unmistakably, that if the investigation into the detention centers continued, they were prepared to go after the children's records again, this time burying evidence, moving kids to even worse facilities out of state, making sure that even if Elijah's name was cleared eventually, the 300 children already trapped in the system would disappear into it even deeper, permanently, before anyone could get them out. Elijah understood, in that moment, that he had a choice. He could fight the fabricated bribery charges against himself with everything he had, clear his name, and risk the investigation collapsing entirely as Holbrook's people scrambled to bury the children even deeper in the system to destroy the evidence. Or he could do something almost incomprehensible. He could let the false accusation stand. He could resign in what would look like disgrace, plead to a reduced charge just to make the case go away quickly and quietly, and in exchange, negotiate through Marcus and the reporter without his own name attached to anything for the immediate release and reevaluation of every child still trapped in those facilities. He chose the children. Elijah worked in complete secrecy with Marcus and the reporter to finalize a deal that nobody, not Dorothy, not Renee, not a single person in his life, would ever know the real terms of, in exchange for his guilty plea to a lesser fabricated charge, which ended his career and stripped him of his judicial pension. The investigation into the detention centers would proceed under the reporter's byline and the Ethics Commission's authority without any connection to Elijah, and, critically, the 300 children would be immediately reviewed and released ahead of any political retaliation. It worked. Within 4 months of Elijah's resignation and quiet plea, Governor Holbrook's juvenile detention scheme collapsed, entirely under the weight of the evidence Elijah had spent a year gathering. Tyrell and nearly 300 other children went home to their families months, sometimes years, earlier than they otherwise would have. Holbrook himself was indicted 18 months later on unrelated corruption charges and never served another day in office. But nobody ever knew that the man who made it all possible was the same man the newspapers were calling a corrupt judge who took bribes. Elijah never said a word in his own defense. He couldn't, not without unraveling the deal that had saved those children, not without giving Holbrook's remaining allies a reason to retaliate against the families who had only just gotten their kids back. So he let the world believe he was guilty. He let his name be dragged through headlines calling him a disgrace to the bench. And the cost of that silence fell hardest not on him, but on the people who loved him and had no idea why he wasn't fighting back. Dorothy begged him, in the beginning, to explain himself. She sat across from him at their kitchen table night after night, asking why he wouldn't defend himself, why he was pleading to something she just knew wasn't true. And all Elijah could say was that he couldn't explain that she had to trust him. But trust, without explanation, has limits, especially when a marriage is being crushed under the public weight of humiliation. Friends, stop calling. Dorothy lost her position on the church council because the pastor said it would be inappropriate given the circumstances. Renee, then 26 years old and just beginning her own career as a paralegal, watched her father's disgrace attach itself to her name in job interviews. Dorothy held on for 3 years, watching the man she loved refuse again and again to simply say he didn't do it. Eventually, the not knowing became its own kind of grief, and something between them broke in a way that never fully healed. Dorothy passed away 6 years after Elijah's resignation from a sudden heart complication. And in her final months, she asked him one more time, gently, if there was anything he wanted to tell her. Elijah, true to the promise he'd made to protect those children and their families even after Holbrook was gone, simply held her hand and said he was sorry for the pain he caused. Dorothy died believing, or at least suspecting, that the husband she loved really had done something wrong. It was the single greatest cost of everything Elijah had sacrificed, and he carried it silently for the rest of his life. Renee's relationship with her father fractured even further after her mother's death. She blamed him, not entirely unfairly from where she stood, for the years of humiliation for her mother's broken heart, for a childhood memory of her father as a respected judge that had been replaced by newspaper photographs captioned with the word disgraced. She moved 2 states away, built a life, married, had a son named Marcus. Coincidentally, though, Elijah always wondered if it was a quiet echo of the public defender's name, since Renee had once known the story existed even if she never knew the truth of it, and she made it clear, without ever needing to say it directly, that her father was not welcome in that life. Elijah's grandson grew up having met his grandfather perhaps 4 or 5 times total, always brief, always tense, always ending with Renee finding a reason to leave early. The boy now, 11 years old, had never once called him Grandpa. He called him Elijah, the way you'd refer to a distant family friend, because that was the only relationship Renee had ever allowed to exist between them. With his career gone, his pension stripped, his marriage devastated, and his daughter's love withdrawn, Elijah did something that surprised almost everyone who had ever known him as a judge. He took a job as a janitor at the very courthouse where he had once presided, the Fairview County Courthouse, the same building where his nameplate had once hung. Outside Courtroom 4, people assumed it was some kind of penance, a disgraced man, punishing himself by returning to the scene of his humiliation. The truth was simpler and sadder. He needed income. His professional reputation made any other work in law impossible, and something in him, some stubborn root, refused to leave the world of justice entirely, even if all that world would let him do now was mop its floors. For 12 years, Elijah Monroe cleaned the courthouse he once ruled over. He emptied the trash cans in chambers where he used to deliberate. He waxed the floors of the courtroom where he once handed down rulings that changed lives. And every single day he endured small, cutting humiliations from people who had no idea, or perhaps some who did know exactly who he used to be and enjoyed the reversal all the more. Attorneys who had once nervously awaited his rulings now tossed files onto the floor in front of him without a word of acknowledgement, letting him bend down to collect them. Younger clerks who had heard the old rumor that the janitor used to be a judge, if you can believe, that would sometimes deliberately knock over their coffee just to see if the old man would actually get down on his knees and clean it, treating it like some grim, private joke. Some called him Old Man. One particularly cruel assistant district attorney had taken to calling him your dishonor under his breath whenever he passed, a play on words he clearly found endlessly clever. Elijah never responded to any of it. He simply did his work quietly, thoroughly, the same way he had once read every page of every file, because whatever the world had taken from him, it had not taken his discipline, and it had not taken the quiet knowledge locked deep inside him of what he had actually done and why. Every night he went home to a small one-bedroom apartment, ate dinner alone, and looked at a single photograph of Dorothy on his nightstand, the only decoration in the entire apartment. Besides a small stack of law books, he still, after everything, could not bring himself to give away. The morning everything changed began like any other. Elijah arrived at 6:15, as he always did, letting himself in through the side entrance before the building officially opened, so he could get the floors done before the first attorneys arrived. He didn't know that today the courthouse was hosting the swearing-in and first sitting of a newly appointed federal judge, a man named Daniel Foster, who had just been confirmed after a fast-tracked nomination and was holding his very first hearing in Courtroom 4 as a courtesy sitting before his permanent federal assignment began. Elijah didn't recognize the name when he'd glanced at the day's docket taped to the break room wall. Federal appointments happened somewhere far above the world he now occupied. What Elijah didn't know, what nobody in that courthouse knew except for one man, was that Daniel Foster had once been a 19-year-old public defense intern, fresh out of his first year of law school, assigned as a research assistant during the exact period Elijah had been secretly building his case against Holbrook's detention scheme. Daniel had worked directly under Marcus Webb. He had spent long nights, 3 years running polling records, cross-referencing sentencing data, helping build the case that ultimately freed those 300 children, though at the time he had been told only that it was sensitive, that he should never discuss it, that the details of who was really behind the investigation had to remain protected. Daniel had gone on to law school, then a prestigious clerkship, then a career that eventually led to a federal appointment, and through every step of it, he had carried a private, burning admiration for a judge he'd only met twice in person, but who Marcus Webb had once, in a rare, unguarded moment, called the most honorable man I have ever known, a man who let the whole world call him a criminal, so 300 kids could go home. Daniel had never learned the judge's name. Marcus, sworn to secrecy even from his own intern, had refused to say it, protecting Elijah's identity even from the people who admired him most. That protection lasted 11 years, until 8 months before this very morning, when Marcus Webb, now retired and diagnosed with a terminal illness called Daniel Foster and finally told him the whole story, including the name. Elijah Monroe. Daniel had sat and stunned. Silence on the phone, remembering the name only vaguely from old news coverage, remembering it as belonging to a judge disgraced for corruption years earlier, and it took him a full minute to understand that everything he believed about that story was a lie, that the corrupt judge was actually the architect of the very rescue operation Daniel had spent his young career helping to execute. Marcus passed away 6 weeks later, and Daniel Foster carried that secret, that debt, with him into his federal confirmation hearings, into his swearing-in ceremony, and finally, on this ordinary Tuesday morning, into Fairview County courthouse for a courtesy sitting he almost didn't accept that something, some instinct he couldn't explain, told him to say yes when it was offered. He walked into Courtroom 4 at 7:45 in the morning, earlier than his hearing was scheduled, wanting a quiet moment in the room before the gallery filled. And there, on his knees in the corner near the jury box, was an older black man in a gray custodial uniform, carefully wiping up a spilled cup of coffee that a young associate had accidentally knocked over 10 minutes earlier while joking with a colleague about watching the old man work. Daniel Foster stopped walking. He stared at the man's profile, at the careful, unhurried way he worked, a manner that seemed strangely out of place for a janitor, dignified in a way that didn't match the menial task at hand. And then the man looked up, and Daniel saw his face fully for the first time in 11 years, aged now, tired in the eyes, but unmistakably, unforgettably, the same face from the one photograph Marcus Webb had shown him months earlier, an old newspaper clipping he'd kept hidden in his desk for over a decade. It was him. It was Elijah Monroe. The gallery had begun to fill by then, lawyers finding their seats, a young clerk setting up her laptop, a bailiff checking his watch, all of them oblivious to what was happening 10 feet in front of them. Daniel Foster stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 4 or 5 seconds. And in that time, every argument he might have made to himself about protocol, about the dignity of his new office, about what people would think, simply evaporated. He thought of 300 children who went home because of the man kneeling on that floor. He thought of Marcus Webb's dying words, asking him to make sure Elijah Monroe's name was cleared, that the world finally knew the truth before it was too late, for that truth to matter to the people who had loved him. And Daniel Foster, a federal judge, 3 weeks into his appointment, unfastened the robe that represented the highest honor of his career, let it fall to the courtroom floor, and walked toward the man everyone else in that room saw only as an old janitor. The room fell silent as he knelt. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice shaking, loud enough now that the entire gallery had turned to look, loud enough that the young associate who'd spilled the coffee just to watch the old man clean it up had gone pale, his mouth slightly open. Elijah, still holding his wet rag, looked at the kneeling federal judge with something that could only be described as disbelief. 12 years of silence and humiliation crashing against this single, impossible moment. "Elijah Monroe," Daniel continued, and now his voice carried clearly across the room, "was one of the most honorable judges this state has ever seen. 12 years ago, he was falsely accused of corruption. He let that lie destroy his career, his marriage, and his relationship with his own family, because the truth would have endangered 300 children who were being illegally held in detention centers as part of a corruption scheme run by Governor Richard Holbrooke." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Somewhere near the back, a court reporter had frozen, with her hands over her keyboard. "He built the case against Holbrooke in secret," Daniel went on, still on his knees, still looking up at Elijah, whose rag had slipped from his fingers onto the floor. "And when Holbrooke's people threatened to bury those children permanently in the system if the investigation continued under his name, he made a deal. He let the world believe he was corrupt. He pled guilty to a fabricated charge, gave up his robe, his pension, his reputation, everything so that those children could go home before it was too late. I know this because I was a 19-year-old research assistant on that case. I helped pull the records that freed those kids, and I never knew, for 11 years, that the man everyone said was disgraced was the one who made it all possible. He paused, his voice breaking now. Everything I know about. Justice, Your Honor, I learned from a case file with your fingerprints all over it, even though your name was nowhere on it. I have spent my entire career trying to be the kind of judge you were, and I didn't even know I was chasing you. The courtroom that had spent 12 years watching this man crawl on his knees to clean up their spilled coffee now watched in a silence, so complete you could hear the old wall clock ticking above the bench. And then Daniel Foster said the words that turned that silence into something else entirely. The people responsible for destroying this man's name are sitting in this courtroom right now. Heads turned. Near the back of the gallery, a man in an expensive gray suit had gone rigid in his seat. It was Charles Vance, the former deputy chief of staff to Governor Holbrook, the man who had personally orchestrated the fabricated bribery case against Elijah 12 years earlier, working directly under Holbrook's instructions, now a partner at a private consulting firm who happened to have a scheduled meeting in the building that morning, an almost unbelievable coincidence that Daniel would later admit felt less like coincidence and more like the kind of justice the universe occasionally allows itself. Beside him sat a woman named Patricia Yoon, a former administrator at one of the detention centers who had helped falsify records and had testified under coercion against Elijah in his plea hearing. Neither of them had recognized the janitor they'd walked past in the hallway that morning. Neither of them had any reason to expect that this ordinary Tuesday would be the day their names surfaced again after 12 years of careful silence. The room erupted, not into chaos exactly, but into a low, disbelieving murmur that swelled as people began to understand what they were witnessing. The bailiff, the same one who had once called Elijah boy, stood frozen near the door, his face draining of color as he tried to reconcile 12 years of casual disrespect with what he was hearing now. The young associate who had spilled the coffee that morning had backed himself against the wall, staring at his own shoes. And Elijah Monroe, the man at the center of it all, slowly sat down, the rag he had been holding, and for the first time in 12 years, in front of the very people who had humiliated him daily, he allowed himself to weep. It wasn't a quiet, dignified tear. It was 12 years breaking open at once, Dorothy's face on his nightstand, Renee's silence, his grandson who had never once called him grandpa, every spilled coffee cup, every old man, every night he'd gone home to an empty apartment carrying a secret he could never share, all of it surfacing in front of a room full of strangers and one federal judge still kneeling before him. Daniel reached out and steadied him, helping him to his feet, and the two men, one in a custodial uniform and one who had just abandoned his own robe on the floor, stood together in the center of courtroom for a while. The rest of the room slowly began to understand that they had spent 12 years mocking a man who had quietly sacrificed everything to save 300 children he would never meet. What happened next moved quickly, because the truth, once it surfaces, tends to gather its own momentum. Within hours, the story reached the State Ethics Commission, the very body Elijah had originally approached over a decade earlier. Within days, journalists who had once written the headlines calling him disgraced were now digging through archived records, finding the paper trail Marcus Webb had preserved, confirming everything Daniel had said in that courtroom. Charles Vance and Patricia Yoon, along with two other former Holbrook officials, were formally investigated and within 4 months indicted for their roles in fabricating the case against Elijah, the statute of limitations having been extended under a special provision once the depth of the conspiracy became clear. It would take over a year for the courts to formally exonerate Elijah Monroe, officially reversing his conviction and restoring his judicial pension. But in the eyes of everyone who mattered, the exoneration had already happened the moment a federal judge knelt on a courthouse floor. The hardest part, the part no headline could fix, was reaching his family. Renee saw the story on the news before Elijah could call her himself, a clip of Daniel Foster's courtroom speech that had already begun spreading, and she sat on her couch in stunned, furious, grieving disbelief, replaying the last 12 years of her life through a completely different lens. She thought of every moment she had judged her father's silence as guilt, every year she had kept her son at arm's length from his grandfather, every chance at understanding she had refused to give him because she believed she already knew the truth. She drove 3 states, 11 hours straight, arriving at Elijah's small apartment near midnight, and when he opened the door and saw her standing there, neither of them said anything for a long time. She simply stepped forward and held on to him the way she hadn't in over a decade, and Elijah, who had carried this secret silently through his wife's death, his daughter's absence, and 12 years of quiet humiliation, finally allowed himself to be held. 3 weeks later, Elijah's grandson, now 11, stood a little awkwardly in the doorway of that same apartment, holding his mother's hand, staring at a grandfather he barely knew. Renee crouched down and told him, gently, the true story, the real one, about the man who gave up everything to save 300 children he'd never met. The boy looked up at Elijah for a long moment, processing something too large for an 11-year-old to fully hold. And then he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around his grandfather's waist. "Grandpa," he said, testing the word like it belonged to someone else, someone he was only just now allowed to claim. Elijah's hands, the same hands that had wiped up 1,000 strangers' spilled coffee, trembled as he held his grandson for the first time in his life as something other than a distant stranger. Elijah never returned to the bench, choosing instead, at 62, to spend his remaining working years as a mentor and advisor to public defenders handling cases involving juvenile detention reform, working alongside Daniel Foster on policy recommendations that would eventually close the loophole Holbrook had exploited, ensuring no governor could ever again quietly profit from keeping children locked away. He kept, for the rest of his life, a small framed photograph on his desk, not of any courtroom triumph, but of the moment a federal judge knelt before him, a photograph a court reporter had taken instinctively on her phone before she even understood what she was capturing. Beside it eventually sat a new photograph too, his grandson's first Little League game, the boy waving at the camera, calling out, "Grandpa, watch this," loud enough for the whole field to hear. 12 years of silence, 12 years of small daily cruelties from people who never knew what they were mocking, 12 years of marriage that ended in doubt, and a daughter who kept her distance, and a grandson who never said the word grandpa. All of it had rested for over a decade on the quiet, unshakable decision of one man who believed that saving 300 children he would never meet was worth more than his own name. He never once regretted it, not even in his loneliest nights, not even holding Dorothy's hand as she died still uncertain of his innocence. Justice, Elijah had always believed, was not about being seen. It was about doing what was right when no one was watching and trusting that someday, somehow, the truth finds its way to daylight, even if it takes 12 long years and a stranger's trembling knees on a courthouse floor to bring it there.